Hey, how's it going? My name is Riley, and I'm a documentary filmmaker that likes talking about everything from filmmaking and creativity to faith. So recently I got my hands on the Sony A7S III and paired it with my Atomos Ninja V and have really been enjoying this setup and shooting ProRes RAW. So in this video, I'm going to take a look at my 5 favorite things about using the Sony A7S III with the Atomos Ninja V. Let's dive in. So right off the bat, I think the thing that I love the most about this setup is the image, and specifically the fact that it's a 12-bit RAW image. For me, coming from the FS5 and A7S Mark II, which shot in 8-bit, this is definitely a huge step up. Now, don't get me wrong, the 10-bit internal codec in the Mark III is definitely an amazing and lovely image, but there's just something special, something a little bit extra that is there with the 12-bit image. I think that you have just a little bit more flexibility to push and pull the information in the image before it starts to break apart and you start to notice some image artifacts. The fact that the image is unprocessed means that you have control over the noise reduction, which helps in this regard as well. And I also think that having such a great image in a small and light form factor is really exciting. And depending on what camera you're used to using, this may not feel like a super small form factor to you, but compared to larger cinema cameras and some of the other stuff that I've used over the years, it really is a lot smaller and compact. It's comfortable to hold in the hand and is definitely easy to shoot with for long periods of time. To go along with image quality, the other really nice thing that I like about this setup is dynamic range. Now, to be clear, you won't get any extra dynamic range when you're filming in RAW versus the internal codecs because the sensor is only capable of so much latitude. But the one thing that I think you will have an advantage with is that you won't need to expose as far to the right. You're able to protect your shadows just slightly less and give yourself a little bit more room in the highlights. And when I think about dynamic range, and when I think most people think about dynamic range, is the highlight roll-off and the information you have in the really bright parts of the image before the image clips. And having 12-bit means that there's a little bit more information in the shadows and midtones to raise that up slightly if you aren't exposing as far to the right. Now, you're absolutely going to have to still light your image and expose your image correctly, but I think you have just a little bit more information to play with if you don't expose quite as far to the right. One other thing that I really like about this setup is the fact that there doesn't seem to be any autofocus compromises. Coming from the A7S Mark II, it's really nice to see how well the autofocus works in the Mark III. And it's also nice that when you send the raw signal out through the HDMI output, that there doesn't seem to be any compromises or features that get turned off. The eye tracking and the face detection all work well when recording in RAW to the Ninja V. And I know that in previous models of Sony cameras, there have been some limitations here, and it's great to see that this doesn't seem to be one. Autofocus is definitely a new feature for me that I'm getting used to, but I think it's one that I will probably use more and more in the future as I get comfortable with it. The fourth thing that I really appreciate about this setup is the size and form factor. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think this really is a big deal for me, and I know it will be for a lot of filmmakers who want something this good and feature-rich in such a small form factor. And specifically, I think there's a handful of things that I really appreciate. For one, being that the screen is 5 inches. I feel like this is the perfect size for a mirrorless setup. I remember the days with the original A7S and the A7S Mark II having to use the original Shogun, and that thing was 7 inches. And it was just way too big. It made the camera setup top heavy. It was hard to rig it up with a top handle, and as well, that setup also had a micro HDMI output. And this is really nice just to have a port that is a full-sized HDMI port. Practically speaking, this means that it's going to be less likely to come loose. It's just going to be easier to connect, and you don't need an extra clamp from the side of your cage to secure that port. As well, it doesn't feel overly heavy, and it's something that you can definitely hold from a top handle or however you want to configure it to film with. A lot of this comes down to personal preference, but for me, being able to mount the monitor on top and be able to use all of the great assist features and not have an issue seeing it or feeling like the camera is top heavy or hard to balance in my hand is something that I really appreciate and is really nice. The fifth and final thing that I appreciate about the A7S III when it's paired with the Ninja V is battery life. Coming from the A7S Mark II and some of the older Sony cameras, the battery life was not abysmal, but it was definitely not something that I enjoyed to use. Getting about an hour or just over an hour at times became really stressful on interviews and shoots that required me to keep filming and keep going. I ended up purchasing a battery grip for my Mark II, and I don't feel like I really need that with the Mark III. The new batteries are really great, and the Ninja V as well is decently efficient with its battery life too. And so you can definitely get through a couple hours on a shoot with both the Sony battery and the Ninja V battery recording raw, which is really nice and is really encouraging. You definitely could rig it up with a larger V-mount battery in the back, but for me, I like to stay as light and compact as I can. So for me, having this better battery life is something that I really appreciate and definitely helps me get through a shoot with less stress and less starting and stopping. There's definitely a lot more great things that I could talk about with this setup, like how easy ProRes RAW is to edit and how great the Ninja V is with just being a monitor in and of itself. If you shoot with the Ninja V paired with the A7S III, let me know in the comments section below. As well, I would love it if you would hit the like button below and consider subscribing. It really is the best way to help me support this channel. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.